Okay. Let me just make sure that looks good. All right. So what we are going to do is we are going to learn about connective tissues. Okay, recording, screen sharing. I just want to make sure everything's set up correctly. Okay, so last week when we met, we talked about epithelial tissues. And now we're going to move on to the second of the four basic tissue types, connective tissues. So remember, of the four basic tissue types, we have epithelial tissue, then connective tissue, then muscular tissue, then nervous tissue. So today we're going to be focusing on connective tissues. Of all the basic tissue types in your body, the connective tissues are the most abundant and the most widely distributed. We're going to break down connective tissues today into three main classes. In lab, you'll be covering only the first class, but I'm going to make this recording so that it's suitable for both my lab and my lecture. So if you're in my lecture, I would recommend that you watch all the way to the end, as you'll need to know about the other two classes, which include special connective tissues and cartilage connective tissues. Now, if you're in my lab, you have options. You can stop after we go through the first class, the proper connective tissues, because that's all we're going to be covering in this week's LT Cura Cloud assignment. We'll have other labs in the future that will cover the other two classes of connective tissues. But if you want a preview or you just want to hear the material more than once, by all means, continue on and watch the rest of the video. So the first class is what we call proper connective tissue. And what we mean by proper is we mean like typical or stereotypical or kind of like the gold standard. So when we're thinking about connective tissues and we're thinking about the ones that have the most shared and general characteristics, we're generally talking about proper connective tissues. The second class is special, and those tissues are in their own category because they really don't fit into proper connective tissues, and you'll see why in a little bit. And they also don't fit in our third class, which is cartilage. So we're going to start off by talking about connective tissue proper connective tissues. Before we do that, let's talk a little bit about the major functions of connective tissues. They're there for binding and support. So connective tissues connect other tissues to each other. The dermis is an example of a connective tissue, and it connects your epidermis to areolar connective tissue and adipose. Those are also types of connective tissue, which connect the dermis to your muscle. So that binding is there to kind of keep all your connective tissues, keep all of your tissues in your body within an organ kind of all stuck and glued together. In terms of support, a lot of connective tissues are important in providing structure and support to organs. Connective tissue can be used for protecting, like how we see the dermis functioning. It can be useful for insulating and storing reserve energy, which is what we see adipose or fat doing. And it can also be useful for transporting substances, like what we see in the blood. So, what makes connective tissues different than the other tissue types is this information right here. This is really important to understand. When we think about epithelial tissues, you'll see that there's a lot of epithelial cells and they're all packed really tightly next to each other. And there's not a lot of other substances or space in between the cells. but connective tissues are way different. Firstly, unlike epithelium, which doesn't have a direct blood supply, connective tissues generally do have a blood supply. It depends on which connective tissue you're talking about as to how good that blood supply is. Obviously, blood has an excellent blood supply, so by definition, it's the best. But then you have other types of connective tissues, like dense, proper connective tissue, which we'll talk about in a bit, which you would find in things like tendons and ligaments. And those tissues have a poor blood supply, which is why if you get an ACL or an MCL injury or you damage your Achilles tendon, they're not going to heal on their own. If it's a severe injury, it's almost always a surgical diagnosis, meaning you're going to have surgery for them to repair that issue. And that's because these particular types of connective tissues have a poor blood supply. But this is crucial. Connective tissues have a lot of extracellular matrix. So what extracellular matrix is it's substances that are not cells. It's acellular or non-cellular. And what this extracellular matrix is substances that have been produced by special connective tissue cells called fibroblasts. And those substances are secreted or excreted outside of the fibroblast cell. And those substances end up taking up a lot of space between cells. The function of the extracellular matrix is to provide a lot of strength and durability. So here is an example of a connective tissue, and you can see how there are very, very few cells here. So this is a piece of tissue from a tendon. And within this entire piece of tissue, we only see 4 cells. There might be 1 or 2 more cells down here, but you get the point. Unlike epithelial tissue, where you had a lot of cells all packed on top of each other, in connective tissue, you have few cells, but you have a lot of extracellular matrix. And that's made up of those substances that the fibroblasts secrete. How do they do that? They do that by making those substances by transcribing and translating genes from your DNA. Those genes are converted into mRNA. Those mRNAs are translated into proteins at the ribosome, and then those proteins get modified in the Golgi apparatus, and then they get secreted using exocytosis to release those substances outside of the cell. The extracellular matrix can be broken down into 2 main components: ground substance and fibers. This is showing you it's kind of giving you a cartoon idea of how you can have 2 cells here and then have a lot of space between those cells. And that space is filled with these connective tissue substances like fibers, like ground substance, which includes proteoglycans and fibronectins, and then a lot of fluid as well. So let's learn a little bit more about the ground substance. I like to think of ground substance as like the hamburger meat of extracellular matrix. It's hamburger meat is steak that's been put through a grinder and it's all ground up, and now it's kind of like a mushy substance that doesn't really have clear structure to it like the fibers in beef do when you have a whole steak. So this ground substance is made out of a lot of fluid. Inter means between. So interstitial fluid is like the fluid between cells. There's a lot of adhesion proteins, which kind of help bind the ground substance and the cells together. And then there's a lot of protein modified carbohydrates. So you've got carbohydrates with like little proteins sticking off of them. Examples of these are the fibronectins and the laminins. Lamins, sorry about that. Okay, moving on to the fibers. Fibers are like the steak of the extracellular matrix. Like if you look at a steak, you can see the muscle fibers intact within it. And these are proteins that have a elongated string-like fibrous shape. Collagen is the strongest connective tissue fiber in your body, and it's one of the most abundant proteins in your body. There are lots and lots and lots of different subtypes of collagen, and they all are found in different cells and tissues and have slightly different functions. Collagen is very strong and provides a lot of tensile strength, like strength when stretched. Second, we have elastic fibers. These fibers are very long, they're very thin, and they're very stretchy. So think of like elastic in your waistband. These elastic fibers are made out of this substance called elastin, which is a very stretchy substance. Lastly, we have reticular fibers, which are short, they're very thin and fine, and they're very, very branched fibers. They offer a lot of like kind of cushion, but also like structure and support. Next, we have our cells. Our cells can take a couple of different forms. If the ending of a cell has the ending blast, I want you to think of this as like an immature, very, very active cell. So if we're thinking about, people of all different ages, I want you to think of blast cells as like the little kids that went out and played in the snow. They're very active, they're running around, they're making snowballs, they're screaming and they're jumping up and down and they're having a great time. Blast cells are these young, immature cells, but they're very, very active. And in cells, when we say cells are active, what we mean is that they're very active making these substances in the ground substance and these fibers, and then secreting them outside of themselves, outside of the fibroblasts. When you see the word ending site, I want you to think of a more mature cell, a cell that is there to kind of maintain the extracellular matrix. And these are kind of more of like our parent or our grandparent cells. Like they're probably not going to be playing in the snow the same way the kids are. They're going to be standing around kind of supervising and maybe giving instructions as needed. So cells that end in site, like chondrocytes, fibrocytes, osteocytes, these are more mature cells that are more responsible for maintaining the extracellular matrix and kind of observing and giving instructions to the other younger cells like fibroblasts, osteoblasts, chondroblasts. In connective tissues, you'll find a variety of other cells too. You might see fat cells, you might see white blood cells like lymphocytes, you might see mast cells, which are actually a type of white blood cell, and they're really important in creating inflammation. And you might see macrophages, which are also a type of white blood cell that have a phagocytic function. Anytime you see this prefix phago, it refers to eating. Okay, they're like the Pac-Man cells. And macrophages have an important immune function by eating dead cells and pathogens and cellular debris. So if you put all this together, here's kind of like a cartoon image of what that might look like. We've got our typical quintessential connective tissue fibroblast. We've got our specialized cells like a macrophage or a white blood cell like a lymphocyte, fat cells, mast cells. Here's another type of white blood cell, all in this matrix of fibers like elastic fibers or these branched thin reticular fibers or these thicker, strong collagen fibers. And then this kind of light bluish white background is representing the ground substance. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to pause with the PowerPoint and I want to help you understand how connective tissues are organized and classified. Because for me, when I was first learning about connective tissues, I found them to be very confusing. And there's so many different types and subtypes and subclasses that I couldn't keep them all straight. So it was helpful for me to um, be able to understand how to classify them. So to do that, I'm going to switch to a whiteboard here. And I have a little tablet that I can use to draw on this whiteboard. And I will tell you the truth, I'm not very good at doing this. So bear with me as I do my best to you can't really see where you're drawing on the tablet. You can only see where your cursor appears on the screen. So bear with me as I try to, go through and draw this. It's like a flow chart to organize. Okay, so first we are going to talk about the classes of connective tissue. Also, it would be helpful for you if, as I'm going through and drawing this, if you draw this too. So get out a piece of paper, hold it landscape like this, okay? Put connective tissues at the top, and then you're going to subdivide. And I would leave probably about half of the space for the proper connective tissues and about the other half of the space for the special and the cartilage connective tissues. And if you run out of space, you can just get another paper and add on. Okay, let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to subdivide into the different classes of connective tissues. Okay, so our first class was proper, and our second class was special, and our last class is cartilage. Okay, we are going to start with proper first. I'm going to kind of move that to the center of my screen. And now we are going to subdivide it into the two subclasses. So proper can be divided into a subclass called loose and a subclass called dense. Okay, let's start with the dense first because that's the order I do it in the PowerPoint. Okay, so there are three different types or three different subcategories of dense, proper connective tissue. The first one is called regular. The second one is called irregular. And the third one is called elastic. So the difference between regular, irregular, and elastic, dense, proper connective tissue is the arrangement or the components of the extracellular matrix. Regular, dense connective tissue, the extracellular matrix is arranged in a way that everything has a regular organization or pattern. Irregular, dense connective tissues, the extracellular matrix is arranged in a more random, unorganized way. Elastic, dense connective tissues have a lot of those stretchy elastic fibers in them. And we'll see examples of these when we go back to the PowerPoint. For now, let's move on to our examples of our loose, proper connective tissue. So in loose, we also have three subcategories. We have a loose tissue called areolar, a loose tissue called adipose, and a loose tissue called reticular. Okay, these are all examples of proper connective tissues that have these extracellular matrix proteins arranged in a loose way, meaning they're not tightly packed together. There's a lot of space in between them. Conversely, the dense proper connective tissues, those extracellular matrix proteins are packed together really, really tightly, and there's not a lot of space around them. All of these cell types are considered proper because the main cell in them is the fibroblast. Okay, so if you've got fibroblasts in your connective tissue, it's probably a proper connective tissue. Next, we're going to move on to our special category. And there are two subcategories of special connective tissue. Blood is one of them. And blood is in its own category because the main cell is not the fibroblast, it's blood cells. So this can be white blood cells, red blood cells, but you'll notice there's no fibroblasts. Our second subcategory of special connective tissue is bone. Okay, in bone, the main cell is the osteocyte. Anytime you see the prefix ost, O-S-T, or os, O-S-S, it's referring to bone. And remember, cyte is referring to a mature cell. That's it for special. I will add a little note though, is that sometimes you will see adipose tissue categorized as a special connective tissue, and it really can belong in either category. All right, last but not least, let's talk about our three subcategories of cartilage. Firstly, we have a type of cartilage called hyaline cartilage. And we have a second type called elastic cartilage. And then we have a third subtype called fibrocartilage. We'll see some examples of these in a bit. So I would keep this handy and refer to it as we are going through our different types of proper connective tissues. And then in the future, we, at least for lab, will be learning about different types of special connective tissues and different types of cartilage connective tissues. Okay, moving on. So we're going to start with this first class of proper connective tissue, and then we'll move on towards the end for special and cartilage. Like I said, proper connective tissue has two different subclasses. We've got dense connective tissues and loose connective tissues, and we're going to talk about dense first. And the different examples of dense connective tissues are regular, irregular, and elastic. So here is an example of what a histology image of dense regular connective tissue would look like. You can see that the extracellular matrix proteins are packed together really, really tightly, which is why it falls into the dense category. And you can see that the arrangement of these proteins, these collagen and elastic fibers, follow a regular arrangement or pattern. So that's why it's a dense, regular connective tissue. You find these types of tissues in tendons and ligaments. Note in this little cartoon here, we've got most of the tissue is made up of our extracellular matrix protein fibers, and there are very, very, very few cells that are in the actual tissue. The cells are a little bit harder to see in this particular histology image. Next, we have an example of dense, irregular, proper connective tissue. The extracellular matrix proteins are still packed together really tightly, which is why it's dense. But now you'll see there's no obvious organization or pattern to them. They're just kind of going all different directions. So that's why this is described as irregular. In this type of tissue, you have a lot of collagen fibers, but you'll also find a lot of elastic fibers. You find this type of tissue in the periosteum, which is a connective tissue that surrounds bones. Remember, if you see this word root ost or os, it's referring to bone. Eum loosely refers to like a confining membrane. And peri means around. So this is like a membrane or a tissue that's wrapped around bone. Perichondrium is very, very similar, except chond refers to cartilage. So anytime you see chond as a word root, I want you to think of cartilage. So this is a type of connective tissue that wraps around cartilage. You can also find this tissue in organ capsules, in your joint capsules, and in the dermis of the skin. And you see an example of that here. This is showing the dermis, this kind of orange second layer of the skin. Our last example of dense, proper connective tissue is dense elastic. And in dense elastic, you see that there's a lot of these thin, kind of squiggly elastic fibers that give the tissue a lot of stretch. There's also collagen fibers present too. You find dense elastic tissues in places that need a lot of stretchiness, like large arteries, certain parts of the heart, certain parts of the airway, like the trachea, the bronchi, and the bronchioles. Okay, that wraps up our dense, proper connective tissues. Now we're going to move on and we're going to talk about the loose, proper connective tissues. The first one is areolar connective tissue. Remember, this is a loose connective tissue because these extracellular matrix proteins are not packed together really tightly. They're arranged more loosely. You can see there's a lot more ground substance. There's a lot more space in between these fibers. The fibers aren't all like packed up against each other. You find areolar tissue beneath your organs, and you find the tissue like between and around different segments of muscle. So when you're cutting boneless, skinless chicken breast and you see that kind of white, membranous stuff that's kind of wrapped around the chicken breast, that's a type of loose areolar connective tissue. Our second example of loose connective tissue is adipose or fat. The reason adipose can also be put into the special category is because the extracellular matrix doesn't really have a lot of collagen or elastin fibers like we see with the other proper connective tissue types. The majority of the extracellular matrix is made up of lipid or fat droplets. These are specialized organelles that you find inside fat cells. And these organelles are specialized in storing fat. They take up the majority of the space inside the cell, and they take up so much space that they actually squish the nuclei and all of the other organelles, like the Golgi, the ribosomes, the endoplasmic reticulum. Everything gets smushed up against the plasma membrane. So this white stuff that you're seeing here is a big organelle called a fat droplet or a lipid droplet, and it's storing fat. You find fat, again, supporting a lot of organs around tissues like muscles, around the kidneys, and your abdomen, and around your heart. Our last example of proper loose connective tissue is the reticular tissue. And this has a lot of those thin branched reticular fibers. Reticular fibers are really, really good at providing structure and support. So they are used as a supportive framework for a lot of your organs, including your lymph nodes, your spleen, and your liver. Again, you see a lot of ground substance in this extracellular matrix. The reticular fibers are not packed really tightly together. So this is why it's an example of loose reticular. So that's all of the connective tissues that we're going to cover for lab. But in lecture, you're going to be learning about the other connective tissues. So I'm just going to continue on and talk about those as well. Our second subclass of connective tissues is the special connective tissues. And within the special connective tissues, we have two different examples. We've got blood and bone. Here we show blood, and with blood, we have red blood cells, and we have white blood cells, and then we have these little cell fragments called platelets, and then the fluid around the cells is the extracellular matrix. It's made up of a kind of saline-like fluid that has a lot of proteins dissolved in it. And of course, the place that you find blood is blood. Our second example of special connective tissues is the bone. Here, the extracellular matrix is made out of osteon. Osteon is a special type of extracellular matrix that you only find in bone. It has a lot of collagen fibers in it, which give it its strength. but the osteon has been hardened by other minerals and substances that make the bone have a lot of hardness and strength. Our third category of connective tissue is cartilage. And in cartilage, you have three subclasses. You have hyaline cartilage, which is also called articular cartilage because you find it on the ends of long bones that articulate or form a joint with each other. Our second subclass is elastic cartilage, and our third is fibrocartilage. Hyaline cartilage contains lots and lots of these little thin collagen fibers. And the main cell here is the chondrocyte. So that's why it doesn't get grouped in the proper connective tissues because the main cell is not the fibroblast. You find hyaline cartilage in a lot of different areas in the body, including the ribs, the nose, the ends of the long bones, certain joint capsules, and the trachea. Our second example of cartilage is elastic cartilage. Elastic cartilage contains a lot of elastic fibers in it, which are those stretchy fibers. And it's still pretty abundant in collagen, but it's a different type of collagen known as type 2 collagen. And we still see the main cell being the chondrocyte. There's only two places in the body that you find elastic cartilage, and that's the ear and the epiglottis. The epiglottis is the little structure in your throat that determines whether air is going to go into the trachea, into the lungs, or if food is going to go into the stomach. So when the epiglottis is open, that allows air to be diverted into the trachea. But when the epiglottis closes, that diverts the substances like food when you're swallowing to go down into the esophagus. Our last example of cartilage is fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage also contains a lot of collagen fibers and chondrocytes, but it has much more extracellular matrix, which allows the cartilage to have more, it allows it to withstand compressive forces and give it a little bit of a flex. Again, there's only two places in the body that you find fibrocartilage. One is in the intervertebral discs in between the vertebra in your spine, and they are there to withstand compressive forces on the spine. And the second place is between the two pubis bones of your hips, and it connects the pubis bones. And because it's made out of fibrocartilage, which kind of has more like flex and give to it, the pubic symphysis can actually flex during pregnancy and delivery to allow women to open their hips up a little bit more so they have more space to deliver a baby. Okay, that wraps up your information on connective tissues. And the next time we meet, we'll be talking about something else.